This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
This episode sees us back in Books Upstairs in Dublin's Delir Street again. This time we've come for a conversation between Paddy Bush and poet and academic Ben Keating on the occasion of the Dublin launch of the Amergin Step, an exploration in the imagination of Iveragh. The book is named after the famous poem that Iveragh Ealaíon, or the Book of Invasions, tells us was recited by the poet and lawmaker of the Gaelic Milesian people as he stepped ashore in Kerry after their voyage from Galicia.
In a book reminiscent of Tim Robinson's Arran and Connemara explorations, Paddy Bush investigates contemporary and historical literature, folklore, myths, archaeology and place names, at the same time as he explores the mountains, sea and islands of the tip of the Iveragh Peninsula to uncover the stories that have animated them from earliest to present times.
Paddy Bush is well known as a poet. He's published 13 collections of poetry, 4 of which are in Irish, and 9 volumes of translation between Irish, English and Scottish Gaelic. A member of Aosdána, he has received the Irish Times Poetry Award, the Michael Hartnett Award, the Chomhairle Ealaíon, although much of his poetry originated in travels in Nepal, China, Greenland and Morocco. The primary and long-standing source of his work has been the land and seascape of his adoptive home on the shore of Ballinskelligs in Kerry in the Iveragh Peninsula, a place that we know very well indeed. Paddy is winner of the O'Connell Award for 2024, and the Amergin Step, we should say, has garnered a lot of praise. No more valuable and compelling book will be published in Ireland this year, says Bernard O'Donoghue. A profound exploration of the time and space of legend and poetry, Ealaíon Ealaíon says. In this wonderful book, Paddy Bush allows us to experience a beloved landscape made all the richer by his poetic eye and his deep knowledge and appreciation. That was the late Eivor Walsh, who supervised the PhD version that later became this book.
So all in all, a really great present indeed. And don't forget to tune in next week when we have a special pre-Christmas treat. Poet Adam Wyatt and novelist Henrietta McCurvey discussing their poetry and fiction choices of the year. So lots of really good stuff there and really good ideas too for literary stocking fillers.
As the boat landed, Amergin put his right foot on the land and said, "Am wind on sea, am wave swelling, am ocean's voice, am stag of 7 clashes, am falcon on cliff, am sunlit dewdrop, am rarest of herbs, am boar enraged, am salmon in pool, am lake in plain, am fortified hilltop, am learning's essence, am sharpened spear dealing death, am God who kindles fire in the head, who makes smooth the stony mountain, who elucidates the lives of the moon, who proclaims where the sun will rest, who leads the stars like cattle from the ocean? On whom do those stars smile? What troop, what god edges blades in a plague-struck fortress? I invoke a poet, poet of wind. This is a fairly, it's a faithful, fairly accurate translation of the Amergin poem, which is, well, its first written form was in the 11th century. I'm not sure how far back it goes, but presumably copied by monks, but it's notable that there is no divine or not divine Christian thing in it. Particularly the first part of that, am this, am that. By the way, I use the am there for a number of reasons rather than I am, because I think of it as a collective thing on behalf of his people. Also because the original medieval Irish says gaite muir, shegin ail, and so forth, and I want to echo that. But also because I hear a connection with the sacred syllable of the East. And that may or may not be a coincidence. Who knows how far back it goes. But, you know, it's a statement. I used, when I translated that first, slightly different version, I called it the claim. Afterwards, I called it the manifesto. Now I call it the Amergin step. Because it is a claim. It's saying, you know, but it's a claim by identifying what it doesn't say we own these cliffs, we own the wildlife, you know, it is ours to do what we want to. It says we are those, they're us. And in a modern sense, and I'm not suggesting for 1 second that the medieval scribe intended this, but in a modern sense, I think you could read it by saying, if you or if we wound any or all of our surroundings, damage them, that we are essentially wounding ourselves. And that, as I said, we know intellectually. I mean, there are the odd lunatic that, you know, says climate change is a hoax or whatever. But, you know, most people know intellectually that this is the truth, but I think it's not felt. When people say, you know, at the weekends I like to go out into nature, as if nature was something separate from our ordinary lives. You know, it's a matter of entering into the nature we live in. It's not just something at the end of David Attenborough's long lens, you know, which again commodifies something. It's the sort of human contact, everyday contact with nature, which I think, you know, we have lost.
A few years ago, I was teaching a literature course in Trinity College Dublin, which explored space and place in relation to Irish landscapes. And I did a bit of reading. One of the geographers I read up on at the time was a professor in University of Minnesota called Yi-Fu Tuan, a famous geographer, who argues something obvious, but I think profound, where he says that place is endowed with meaning from experience. Yi-Fu Tuan writes, place is a center of meaning constructed by experience. Place is known not only through the eyes and mind, but also through the more passive and direct modes of experience. To know a place fully means both to understand it in an abstract way and to know it as one person knows another. Now, as Paddy Bush has been exploring the Iveragh Peninsula through the eyes and mind for several decades now, and the Amergin step is the fruit of a great deal of accumulated experience. And to my mind, it confirms something that Tim Robinson writes in one of his last essays, where he says, "It is the attention we bring to it that makes place out of location." In the Amergin step, the reader joins with the author on a number of journeys to explore the features of the Iveragh Peninsula, from the Stone Age and Bronze Ages up to our own present moment. And each excursion traces and retraces a new line of vision. And there are many examples of this sudden jolt of understanding as to how the terrain is configured. In fact, you could say that Paddy Bush provides what Tim Robinson also calls a secular version of the miraculous by calling forth an awareness of a given place's constitution. That is to say, the causal net that brought it into existence, from cosmic origins to the casual touch of local microhistory. Taken together, these insights provide what Bush calls an illuminative value for the terrain they describe. helping us to make sense of what otherwise might appear arbitrary, mere location rather than place.
Who makes smooth the stony mountain? Who elucidates the lives of the moon? Who proclaims where the sun will rest? Who leads the stars like cattle from the ocean? On whom do those stars smile? What troop, what god edges blades in a plague-struck fortress? I invoke a poet, poet of wind.
I'll say a few words now about listening, what Paddy Bush calls listening to landscape. You'll find in the book there's a historical sweep, which is framed in places in terms of listening to the stories that landscape tells. For example, as Bush surveys Dingle Bay from the top of Drung Hill, he writes of the whispered echoes of the past that the attentive listener can still catch on the wind. And such is the archaeological and geological historical complexity of just one vantage point, that Bush speaks of the sense of a multitude of different voices to be heard, if only we can open ourselves to them. And there are abundant examples in the book of how we experience the world hourly, and how the sudden onset of silence, where we expect to hear voices, can carry an extremely sinister resonance. For example, the stillness of the recent pandemic, notwithstanding the birdsong that suddenly became audible, but also the terrible and unbearable silence, to quote from the book, that arose from the famine. And it's perhaps fitting that in the book's coda, Paddy Bush cites or quotes in full Brendan Kennelly's another Kerry poet, Brendan Kennelly's great poem, The Dark Fathers, where Kennelly speaks in the final stanza of unapplauding hands and broken song. The great silence of the mid-19th century is a somber reminder that landscape is essentially a human construct, and that its gaps and missing voices should be looked for and listened to. More heartening is Paddy Bush's demonstrations of how landscape leaves everywhere traces of what we have in common, and that even the remotest locations, like Skellig Michael, have hallmarks of, and again I'm quoting, social connectivity, organisation, and commonality. And Amergin himself came, as we know, from continental Europe, and his step onto the shore at the bottom of Paddy Bush's garden, I believe.
Definitely.
It suggests a communal framework of, again I quote, legislation, gathering, identity, energy. So it's a social, it's more social than it is to do with solitariness or seclusion. The poet Richard Murphy, who's a writer I've spent some time talking about and analysing and publishing about, he used to write regularly in his journal in the 1970s about his own solitude on High Island off the Galway coast, another monastic community. For example, on the 4th of August 1970, this is from Murphy's journal, Murphy wrote, "Everything on the island connects. That is its glory, connecting what appears to be disconnected." And I think these lines might help us to better understand what Paddy Bush writes when he speaks of Skellig Michael as his own imaginative touchstone, And here I'm quoting again from the Amergin steppe. At the margin of the known world, when it was settled by monks, it is now uninhabited. It is at the same time the centre of its own unique, self-contained world. And for those who manage to enter that world, and especially those who manage to give artistic expression to that world, marginality and centrality tend to resist definition and limitation. So it may also be helpful to read the Amergin steppe as a book of connections as much as of silences, in the same way that the Gaelic poet Tomás Ruaidh O'Sullivan uses the phrase as Gaeilge, meaning plentiful in a net, which is quoted in the wonderful section on Derrynan and the O'Connell family, lines suggesting a social network in the locality. So I'll just finish my brief introduction with some comments on the title, The Amergin Steppe, because it's very much part of the project, I think, which Paddy Bush has embarked on here. His own translation of the original poem, The Song of Amergin, is actually retitled in the book as The Amergin Steppe. And it suggests how that ancient poem can be heard again today. And the first chapter is called Milesian Footprints. And in it, Paddy Bush suggests, if we can imaginatively take the step that Amergin takes in the poem, we can redeem our relationship with our surroundings. At the most elemental level, the Amergin steppe is part of a collective understanding to move away from our destructive relationship with our surroundings and our planet and aim for something more responsible, a more harmonious way of living, one that might help avert the imminent danger of climate catastrophe while rejuvenating our local lives as well. And as the book makes clear, the steppe, the Amergin steppe, should be thought of as an inclusive ecological manifesto. Those are the words that Paddy Bush uses. One which has many tributaries from the fields of archaeology, myth, folklore, history, and literature. It involves a more communal identification with place, a more holistic sense of our relations with our environment. And of course, Paddy Bush has written many and published many poems with Amergin, beginning with his earliest collection in 1989 of that title. And these poems are wonderfully scattered through the book. So as a whole, the Amergin steppe looks backwards and forwards, allowing the inaugural moment of Amergin's arrival in Paddy Bush's garden to serve as an ecological motif for our times. And I think the aim and purpose is to go back into another way of experiencing the world, as he says in the text, a different way of appropriating the world we live in, physically and imaginatively.
Well, I suppose the actual writing of the book came at the end of a very long process of exploration, during which I had no idea I was going to be writing the book. So, I had heard of the Milesians, I'd never heard of Amergin's poem, didn't know where the Milesians were said to have landed according to the Iveragh. I learned all these things when I blew into South Kerry more than 50 years ago, and started to explore them out of interest. The same thing with O'Connell. When I started writing, which was really, it was about 10 years after that I started rewriting poems, which I hadn't done since my teens. I realized that for me, and I emphasize this is a personal exploration, other people would tell other stories. There were three very big stories for me: the Miletian invasion, and particularly Amergin, Skellig Michael, and of course other bits of early Christianity, less spectacular, but equally sort of pregnant with meaning in the landscape. And of course Daniel O'Connell, which I realised afterwards included the whole O'Connell family, and particularly their context in Iveragh. That they were the big stories, so I was exploring them. And then, maybe 10 or I suppose 15 years ago, I decided I would write a book something like this, and I kept that decision pristine and, in a cupboard for about 10 years. And I decided in the end, the only way to do it was give myself a unavoidable kick in the arse. So I did a PhD in creative writing in UCC, of which that was my thesis. Otherwise, it probably would never have been written, because I tend to work in sporadic and fragmentary ways. But for the actual writing of it then, which was really to sort of put into words the exploration I'd been doing for 30 years, even though I had been to the places many, many times, I went again by myself a number of times with the book in mind, so that I wouldn't be giving a general picture of the place, that it would be specific, with specific weather, me in specific moods, that I could contextualize it. I did that with the exception of Skellig, which was closed for COVID during my writing of this, but I had visited Skellig over 100 times anywhere and stayed there perhaps a dozen times, so I knew it fairly intimately. So I'm exploring the actual physical landscape and then the imaginative landscape, which is the way I think of it, at the same time, and I wanted to integrate those. Not in a guidebook sort of way, like I'm not telling anybody how to get there or anything like that, but simply to establish that for the reader, they're exploring the literature, but that they get a feel of what the landscape is. I suppose that I was writing the O'Connell chapter. O'Connell was, a metropolitan, international figure, but the O'Connell I was interested in was O'Connell in Iveragh. And, Iveragh was a place for which he had an enormous love, and in a almost Wordsworthian sort of way, that said that it shaped him morally and intellectually. He said that in a letter to Walter Savage Landor. So I suppose the contrast between the quiet landscape of Derrynane and the whole surrounds, and an awareness that this was changed from what it was months before and what it would be, one hoped at the time, months afterwards, and an awareness of the difference between the noisy world of politics and business and history, as opposed to the contemplative world I was in. I suppose that it was a kind of philosophical thing rather than a research thing. And it also gave me plenty time to explore the landscape. And in that, I explored around Derrynane House and came to discover a path which had been forgotten, which was built by O'Connell. So it gave that sort of time and space to explore.
You also made some discoveries about Ellen O'Connell and her poetry, which is a subject of part of that chapter on the O'Connell family.
Yeah, well, Ellen O'Connell, it was hiding in plain sight. Once I started looking for things on the internet, and afterwards I got a copy of the first edition of her one and only book from Kenny's. It was there. It wasn't that I had to piece together something in a scholarly way, but it's a poem that I think was completely forgotten about. And, while much of Ellen's poetry is fair, kind of dull or predictable or whatever, her portrait of Derrynane and of her father in 1832, and it was published in a political review in 1832 at the height of a very important election. It contains some very fine poetry. I think it's about 500 lines altogether, and in it she portrays her father as she specifically mentioned that he was formed by the landscape round Derrynane. She talks about how he was the conqueror of Wellington, but at the same time she talks about how his grandchildren, presumably her children, wind him. That they wind him round their fingers, and he's telling them stories before to go to bed. It's a very very familiar sort of picture, also a very moving picture, but it's also, to my mind, a very politically shrewd piece of thing. This was being published in the Irish Review of Literature and Politics, something like that, in December 1832, during which the voting was going on. So it's almost like a hello magazine. Here's Daniel O'Connell at home.
Yeah.
Meet the conqueror of Wellington, being very nice to his grandchildren. Now, it wasn't just O'Connell. There were actually 5, between sons and sons-in-law, 5 O'Connells took their seats in Westminster after that election, as opposed to the single one O'Connell had before them. One of them was Ellen O'Connell's husband. So it's a very rich poem that way. But I'd read other things about O'Connell at home, particularly from O'Neill Daunt, from Aubrey de Vere, from various people, very vivid descriptions. But in all the biographies I'd read of O'Connell, there was no mention of Ellen's thing. So I felt I was discovering that. I think she got forgotten, basically because she was a woman.
Sure.
And then, of course, in that she described the meadow walk. And as it being again opened by her father. And I asked members of the O'Connell family, of the OPW staff, where was the meadow walk. They didn't know anything about it. I knew it was a real place because O'Neill Daunt, a great friend of O'Connell, also mentioned it when he was going up hunting beagles, as O'Connell brought all his visitors doing, or not hunting beagles, but hunting hares with beagles. So I knew it was a real place. And again, because I had the enforced leisure of the lockdown at the time, having failed to find it, I suddenly really realised the obvious thing was go back to the original Ordnance Survey maps and which would have been actually the survey work would have been done in the late 1820s and through the 1830s. And there they have, they didn't call it the Meadow Walk, but footpath marked. And it coincided with O'Neill Daunt's description and Ellen's description. So that was obviously it. And then with the OPW workers, we went with printouts of those maps, found foundations of a bridge over the stream, and were able to piece together to the walk. And it's now a much used part of the thing. So partly because of the lockdown and everything, I had the leisure to do that. There were no crowds around Derrynane. It was all closed up. But I got particular satisfaction that it was a poem leading to the landscape, physically uncovering something that had been built by her father. Yeah. And just on Ellen, I think it's worth mentioning, there's Ellen was known to her father as Nellie, which was also the name by which Eileen Dove was known to, Eileen Dove Niconnell of Queen Arthur Lara was known to her family. They talked about our sister Nellie. So, O'Connell's daughter was obviously named after her. So it's a link there. And all of those things, I got great satisfaction. I probably would have been running around the place more if it hadn't been for the lockdown. And it helped that way.
And I mentioned there in my remarks about this idea of the margin and centre, that it resists definition and limitation, which is what you say in the book. And I was referring to Skellig, but in fact, Daniel O'Connell is probably a better example, because there he is hunting hares near Derrynane, but he's also answering his mail from London, looking at the newspapers and all of that.
Yeah, there's that wonderful image. Again, it was O'Neill Daunt, in the same thing as you mentioned, the Meadow Walk, talked about that when they were hunting up at Coomachishta. Walter Mackin used it afterwards in the novel, in what's it called, The Silent People. It's, something that's mentioned an awful lot, that, newspapers for London was brought to him, and he read them while he was having his breakfast, and then off hunting the hares again. As soon as the hare appeared, he threw these things away, and off he went. So those two things, those two aspects of his life, very much in that little anecdote. So this is how O'Connell in Iveragh it's amazingly important. If you don't mind, I'll read a very short thing. This, in a way, is a poem. I claimed it as a poem I wrote, but I called it found poem because I took except for the first line of this, everything is taken from a letter Hunting Cap, who was O'Connell's uncle, from whom he inherited Derrynane, and a very stern and practical person who opposed O'Connell's marriage because it wasn't an heiress he married. But this is the letter he wrote to O'Connell's mother when O'Connell was studying in Dublin, studying law, so a very young man. And he said, the first line, which is my own, Hunting Cap wrote to Dan's mother. He is, I am told, employed at visiting the seats of hares at Kilreely, the earths of foxes at Tarmans, the caves of otters at Bolus, and the celebration of Miss Burke's wedding at Direen. Useful avocations, laudable pursuits for a nominal student at law. I think a lot of parents might recognise the type of context, but it's very indicative of O'Connell. Those are places, wild places, remote places, scattered through Iveragh. But it also shows, Hunting Cap was this very prosaic, practical, down-to-earth man. Not only did he oppose O'Connell's wedding, he opposed his own brother's wedding as head of the family. He wouldn't forgive Eileen Dovney Connell for years and years when his brother implored him to. But his facility with words there, and this goes right through. I mean, O'Connell, that I know of, never wrote what's normally called literature in his life, but his way with words in court cases, in speeches here and this, is in both Irish and English, a tradition he inherited that was part of the O'Connell tradition, but as I say, linked in very much with the place and the activities of that place.
So that was Paddy Bush talking to Ben Keating about the Amergin step, an exploration in the imagination of Iveragh, and it's published in Dingle by Dingle Publishing Services.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.